This is Join Us in France, episode 491, 491. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we take a conversational journey through the beauty, culture, and flavors of France. Today, I bring you a conversation with Elyse Rivin of Toulouse Guided Walks about the life and legacy of Maurice Ravel, one of France's most esteemed composers whose works continue to enchant and inspire music lovers around the globe. For anyone with a passion for French culture and music, understanding Ravel's contributions is not just a pleasure, it's a necessity. His compositions, including the ever-popular Boléro and the intricate Piano Concerto in G major, showcase a unique blend of musical innovation, technical skill, and a deep infusion of the cultural motifs that make French music distinctly enchanting. For Francophiles, Ravel's music is a gateway to understanding the broader cultural movements of early 20th century France, reflecting the artistic, literacy, and social currents of his time. Stay tuned as we celebrate the rich musical heritage of Maurice Ravel and discover why his legacy is essential for anyone who loves France and its artistic contributions to the world. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my itinerary consult service, my GPS self-guided tours of Paris on the Voice Map app, or take a day trip with me around the Southwest in my electric car. Only the Southwest, though. Somebody asked me this week if I could do this in Marseille and Paris. No, only the Southwest, okay? You can browse all of that at my boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Patreon supporters get new episodes as soon as they are ready and ads free. If that sounds good to you, be like them. Follow the link in the show notes. For the magazine part of the podcast, after my chat with Elyse today, I'll share a few thoughts about taking the train in France because there's been a lot of conversation about that on the Facebook group for the podcast and also on my itinerary calls. Bonjour, Elyse.
Bonjour, Annie.
We have a composer with us today.
Yes, the first time, I think.
Yes, it is our first time talking about a composer as far as
I believe so. We've talked about writers and we've talked about painters and famous people in history, but I don't think we've ever talked about anybody who wrote music.
Yes, and this one is easy to listen to, which is wonderful. I will let you take it away. I don't know that much about him. So this morning I got up and I knew we were going to record about Ravel. So Maurice Ravel, 1875 is when he was born. And so this is the end of the Romantic kind of period. He's really easy to listen to. I'm sure all of you have heard some of his music, even if you're not into classical music. And so this morning when I got up, I started listening to Ravel, and I've been listening to Ravel all morning, and it's lovely stuff.
It's lovely stuff.
Yes.
It really is lovely stuff.
Yes.
Yes. It is very interesting, too. I was thinking as I was doing some research and making some show notes, we've talked a lot about painters and artists and writers. This is also someone who showed a great gift for music, in this case, music, at an early age. It's like there's a whole collection of these people who were talented from the beginning.
Well, I think one of the important things in life is to recognize what your kids are good at and then encourage them in that direction. And some people do that well and some people don't.
That is very true. So Maurice Ravel, he was born actually in the Basque country. He was born in Sargent and Elyse, but as a baby, a little baby, his family moved to Paris, and that is where basically he grew up, and that is where he lived for most of his life. And interestingly enough, his parents, who were not artists, but were very interested in the arts, were interested in music, had friends who were in the arts, were apparently very, very cultivated people, very modern for the time that he was born, 1875, which is really when, think about it, that in 1874 was the first time the word impressionism was used, was 1 year before his birth, right? And that was, of course, in relation to the painting by Monet. And so the last quarter of the 19th century is a period of great change and a lot of creativity and invention in all the arts.
Right. Right.
And particularly painting and music too. And of course, someone who became an associate but was a little bit older was Debussy.
Sure.
And eventually, someone I know you love a lot, Gabriel Fauré, who a little bit later on in the story of Ravel was actually one of his teachers.
Right. Yes. Fauré, if you don't know the music of Gabriel Fauré, do yourself a favor and listen to it. It's absolutely wonderful.
It's what Annie loves. Annie loves. So Maurice was basically brought up in this very encouraging atmosphere, if you want to call it that. And his mom, even though apparently she didn't have any Spanish ancestors, loved Spanish music and played Spanish music in the house. And he grew up listening to Spanish melodies a lot, melodies from Andalusia, connected to, I suppose, I can hear them in my head, basically. All of those strange rhythms and melodies that come from the south of Spain. And he was interested in all of these kinds of musics that were not part of the classical tradition in France. And so his parents allowed him to start having piano lessons at the age of 6.
It's a very good time to start.
It's a very good time to start. He apparently wanted them. He was really happy to have them. And at the age of 12, he began his first classes in musical composition.
Wow.
This is already very impressive as far as I'm concerned, because as much as I have spent years in the visual arts, music is a mystery to me. I love it, but I can't produce a note on key. And the idea that people can and that they can write music, to me, this is like a miracle of the gods, I mean, this is just, it's wonderful, So at the age of 12, he began composition. And 2 years later, in 1889, he entered the conservatory.
Yes, which is normal. I mean, in France, if you are good at music and if you're, motivated to learn music, the normal course is to enter the conservatory, and they do normal school. So they will do their French, math, history, all of that. But they also do a lot of music.
And it's very interesting because he did stay in the conservatory actually for several years. But apparently, I don't know if he wrote it down or it was simply that he told his parents and people around him, he found it a little bit discouraging because he thought it was too conservative, basically. He was interested, even at an early age, in experimentation. And obviously, you have to have the bass. You have to have the bass for composition. You have to have the bass for different ways of putting music together. But he was at odds with a lot of what was going on in the conservatory. And at one point, he left, and he actually went and studied with Gabriel Fauré, who was at the time considered to be the greatest living French composer.
They were right.
They were right. And interestingly enough, Fauré found Ravel to be very interesting because of his new ideas. It must have been interesting for Fauré, I don't know anything really about him, but to have a student who was inventive. I mean, I can imagine it. I transpose it into the visual arts and I can just say, yes, that's wonderful. You have somebody who has an idea that they want to do something. It's not just copying other people, that kind of thing.
Which, I mean, but it's okay if a young student starts by copying other people, right?
Right. But then you have to sort of break out. Somewhere you have to do your own thing,
But you have to find your own voice.
That's the right term for it, to find your own voice. And so apparently Ravel, because of this attitude that was a little bit off from what was considered to be even mainstream at the time, he was very, very frustrated because 4 times he presented himself as a candidate for the Prix de Rome, which is the prize, which is a prize, I believe, it's in painting and it's in writing and it's in music, the Prix de Rome. And 4 times he came in second.
Oh.
He never won it. Strangely enough, he was never the top. He was never considered the top. But by the time he was in his early 20s, he was starting to become well known for his music.
Wow, that's impressive.
And he was known both as a composer and as a pianist. He was a magnificent pianist. I don't know, since he died in 1937, there must be some recordings of him playing. I don't know if there are.
Probably, yeah.
Some very early, scratchy, phonograph ones. It would be interesting to find one. He wound up having a group of people who basically gravitated around him in Paris because he was an odd fellow. I mean, if you see pictures of him, he was rather interesting looking. He kind of reminds me of a little bit of a ferret. He was very small. He was only 5'3", which means he was really not big at all.
My height.
Well, you think you're 5'3". I think you're taller than that. But he weighed 48 kilos. You and I together if we took off, like one arm would weigh 48 kilos, it's like.
Yeah, I'm beyond that. Yeah.
I mean, he was really small, and he apparently, his entire life was just his music. He was never in his entire life known to have any romantic relationships, men or women, nothing.
Really?
Yeah, nothing. There's no scuttlebutt. There's no gossip. There's some suggestion that maybe he had some tendencies, but he never acted on them. Basically, he was really so devoted to his music, and that was the center of his life. So I read a whole bunch of different articles, and they said, no, nobody knows of any particular romantic connection. But
now, when you said tendencies, you mean perhaps he preferred males?
Perhaps he preferred men and didn't want to act on it. I mean, it's not clear, because certainly he was gravitating in a world where it was perfectly acceptable. The end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, the bohemian life of Paris was not a life where you had to be correct. I mean, if you think about what people like Picasso and all of his painter friends did, I mean, they did just about everything. I mean, we're talking about sleeping with anybody you want to, taking drugs. I mean, it was very, very, very free and bohemian.
Right. But at the same time, people were punished for homosexuality in France.
Yes.
So perhaps he didn't feel as free as, yeah.
In any event, apparently there was never really a lot of gossip about him in that way. So it kind of became the mystery of his life. Was it just music, or was he timid? Was, what the reasons were. In any event, he wound up having this enormous group of musicians, composers, and artists around him. And they call themselves the Apaches.
Oh, why?
Why? Well, the term Apache, which of course in French would be Apache, which was of course taken from having seen Wild Bill, what's his name? The
Buffalo Bill?
Buffalo Bill. He came through Paris and France doing his show with bringing, Native Americans with him. The term, of course, got picked up by the French. And it was used to describe the bad kids, like delinquents in neighborhoods. That was the original.
Correct. Yes, that's what I know the term as.
So apparently, because these were the bad boys and girls of the arts.
Oh, I see.
That's what they decided to call themselves. And so they literally put out that they were the Apaches of the arts. I mean, this was their thing. This was their thing. And he was the center of it.
So he had plenty of social life.
Oh, yes. Right. He had social life, and apparently up until the very end, when he was too sick to go out, he had a very active night social life. I mean, he spent his nights going to clubs, to concerts. It was basically a guy who was never home, It was one of those,
That's interesting that it was only socially, but not a private.
Qui sait?
Oui. On sait pas.
On ne sait pas.
Yeah.
No. But among the people that hung out with him were Stravinsky, who, of course, Igor Stravinsky, who is really also a major composer, a little bit younger than him, and Debussy, who's a teeny little bit older, but who, of course, is the other French composer associated with what is called Impressionist music.
Can you imagine hanging out with Stravinsky and Debussy and Ravel? Oh, amazing.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. They were aware of the fact that they were considered to be impressionists. They weren't insulted by the term. I mean, for them, even though they had very rigorous training, of course, in the construction of their music and everything, the idea came from, of course, the painters, the idea that it was mood. There was a lot of mood in the music, and that there was a certain fluidity in the music, which, of course, if you listen to Debussy, certainly you really understand right away,
Right. It's easy to pick out. Have you ever played a thing called the piano puzzler?
No.
Okay, so this is a great thing. It's an NPR show of sorts where you have a pianist that will play a famous tune in the style of, he will write a famous tune, rewrite it in the style of somebody. And you have to guess who the style was and what the piece was. Yes. And so we often do this with my husband, and Debussy is really easy to recognize as a composer. Ravel, not as much.
Not as much.
Right.
Not as much.
He's harder to guess because he had a bigger kind of palette of moods,
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I like Debussy, actually. There was a period where I listened to him a lot, but it's pretty much all similar. It's kind of like a Debussy, whatever that is,
A strong signature. He had a strong signature. Let's put it that way.
You're absolutely right. And Ravel, of course, was I think it sounds like he was someone constantly interested in innovation and trying out new kinds of music and moving into mixing things together. And so this group of Apaches, they basically hung out together, and it started in 1901 and it lasted until the beginning of World War I. So that's a fair amount of time. I mean, if you think about it, it's just about 13 years or so. And interestingly enough, Ravel, who by the outbreak of World War I was not a youngster anymore. He was 40 going on 41. He wanted to join up as a soldier. He was apparently extremely patriotic, and he was refused because of his size and because he was considered to be too frail. And he insisted so much on entering into the fight. It's kind of hard to imagine this man who spent his life with music wanting so badly to go and fight. But in order to be part of the war effort, it took him until 1916, and then he was enrolled as a truck ambulance driver.
Interesting.
Which, of course, made him feel like he was participating somehow in the war effort.
Which he was. Except that by the beginning of 1917, he got dysentery and was demobilized. Right. Sent home.
And so that was the end of his military career. It probably discouraged him a little bit, but it also probably saved him.
Right. It's amazing that somebody in his 40s who could have easily avoided the draft or going to war at all just wanted to. And if you imagine somebody who's 45 kilos, some really frail guy saying, I want to go to war, it takes some cojones.
Yeah, it does. It really does. This is interesting, though. Right after World War I, now Ravel is really well known. I mean, he's a famous composer and famous pianist. So the war is over, and he gets into a philosophical debate with Debussy, among others, because after World War I, Debussy decided that he only wanted to play what he considered to be patriotic music.
Right. So there was a problem with German music, obviously.
And of course, at the time, many of the composers right through the 19th century and into the 20th were, in fact, Austrian or German.
Right.
And so Ravel and Debussy had a falling out because in spite of being a part of the war, he believed that music transcended differences.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Knowing me, I would have a hard time performing music from a country that just tried to beat you out of existence.
I have more of an ambivalent attitude as an artist, I'd say, about all of that. So I will not say exactly, but I really kind of agree with Ravel. I do. Unless somebody really puts out their extreme patriotism, their political positions that are really extreme, I really have a tendency to believe that art should transcend these kinds of nationalistic kinds of things. In any event, Ravel encouraged Schoenberg, who was Austrian, and Bartók, who was Hungarian, because these were, of course, the new next wave of very, very inventive and very, very modern composers with atonal music and things coming out of really the kind of stuff that Ravel had developed,
Yes. So Bartók is also easy to pick out because, he introduced a whole lot of new types of sounds that we weren't used to hearing.
Right. Yes. Well, some people still won't want to listen to Bartók. I mean, you have to really like that kind of music.
I think it's nice.
Some of it I like, actually. So in 1920, this is Mr. Maurice Ravel. He is nominated for the Legion of Honor. And he turns it down.
Why?
He said that he will not take a prize. It's interesting considering that as a young man, he wanted so desperately to have the Prix de Rome, right?
Yeah.
He said that the Legion of Honor was a government prize. And I've translated the quote. He says that no government or prince is going to decorate him because that means they have the right to judge whether his work is good or not.
Oh, dear. Yes. Okay.
So hoity-doo-doo. So he did not take his Legion of Honor. He refused it. Never got it.
That's a bit much. Huh?
Yeah. Very, very proud man, I'd say, I mean, interesting, this idea. You get that today in things like the prizes for painting, prizes for acting. Every once in a while, you get somebody who goes, well, you can't tell me whether it's good or not. It's a very interesting kind of attitude to have. I mean, it's kind of,
Well, it's a fact that in the arts, your productions are going to be judged. How do you not And whether it's the arts or anything else, like if you build houses, people will have an idea of whether they like your houses or not. And if you're a gardener, do they like your garden or not? And,
I know. I've known other people, or I've read about other people in different forms of the arts, including architecture, who have also refused prizes for the same exact reason. It's like, don't tell me whether my work is good or not. But it's a very particular kind of stance to take,
I do know that he was not super prolific as a composer. So I think he only published about 60 pieces his whole life, which is not a lot. There are composers who, 1,000 and then some. And it's because he would just agonize over every note and he wanted things to be just right. So clearly he had high standards when it came to his work, but not wanting it to be, kind of judged or...
It's interesting. It's like he was his own judge and then you listen to it or not, but nobody's going to decide whether it's an interesting position to take, right?
Worth of a prize or not.
Right.
Interesting.
So that was 1920. And then in 1928, so 1928, let's see, he is 25, 35, 45, 53. In 1928, he has his dream wish come true and he goes on a grand tour of the United States.
Wow.
In the interim, between 1900 and 1920, he already was aware of American music and mostly Afro-American music. He had been able to hear some music that came from the States with the people who had moved to France and moved to Europe, especially after World War I. And so he began this enormous, enormous tour of the United States, both as a pianist, as a composer, and as a conductor of orchestra. So he did the grand tour, although he did spend a good deal of time in New York.
Right.
And while he was in New York, and I think he spent just about the whole year on this visit to the United States, he spent just about every single night going to jazz clubs, to listen to ragtime music, to jazz music, to blues music. He spent his nights in Harlem, and he became very good friends with someone whose work I love, and that is George Gershwin.
There's a lot of similarities between the two, as a matter of fact.
Right. And Gershwin, of course, who was younger, idolized him, apparently. I saw a few pictures yesterday. I was looking on the internet, and there were a whole group of people, including impresarios and everything. So they became relatively good friends. And there's a story, who knows if it's exactly true, that at one point Gershwin said to Ravel that he wanted to study composition with him. Now, in 1928, I don't know exactly how old Gershwin was, but he was already making a name for himself as a composer. And Ravel said no. And when Gershwin asked why, he said, because if you study composition with me, you will wind up being a second-rate Ravel instead of being a first-rate Gershwin.
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting way to put it.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's absolutely wonderful. Basically, he's saying, you have your own voice. You don't need to study with me to continue it, that kind of thing, which I think is just a great quote,
Yeah, it's very nice.
So he returns to Paris. And at that moment, at the very, very end of 1928, he's commissioned to write a piece of music for a ballet by one of his friends, a Russian ballet dancer named Ida Rubinstein. I don't know that much about her, but she was actually the person who made the demand on Ravel to write a piece for her for a ballet she wanted to perform.
So she commissioned a piece.
Yeah. And between July and October of 1928, he worked on a piece of music that is now considered to be the most played piece of music in the world, and that is Bolero.
Right. I think Bolero and Four Seasons are probably the most played music in the world.
It's a piece of music that lasts 17 minutes. It is based on an Andalusian theme that he remembered from his childhood. I don't know much about musical terms, but it says that there's a ritournelle in it, which obviously is the way of, I suppose, repetition.
Right. It's a returning pattern.
It's a returning pattern. And there's just two themes to it. And of course, it's the same notes over and over and over again at different rhythms, it's fast and slow. And it ends in a crescendo.
And also he adds instruments. So different instruments take the melody and they sound quite different. So it adds to the interest, and you have this drum the whole time.
It's hypnotic.
Yes. It is
It's
hypnotic.
absolutely hypnotic. The premiere of Bolero was on the 22nd of November at the Opera Garnier. Apparently, it was a packed house. And most of the people apparently did not know what to make of this piece of music. There were a few people who said he was out of his mind. But I don't know if at the time people actually walked out or not, you know?
Oh, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But some people actually wrote afterwards and said, what was he doing? What was he thinking? But for most of the people there, they thought it was fabulous. And it was an enormous and huge success. It was very controversial as a piece of music. It was not like anything anybody had ever performed before. And the irony, of course, is that in the end, at the end of his career, he really did not consider it to be the most important piece of music that he had written. But it is the piece of music that he is absolutely the most known for.
Well, that's the thing. He wrote so much. Like he wrote a lot of piano concertos. He wrote things for solo pianists that are just beautiful. And yet he's known for the most approachable piece that he ever wrote, which I happen to like. Yeah. So it's just a personal choice. I think it's a beautiful ballet. I've seen some beautiful dancing to it.
I actually had a chance a number of years ago. This is a while ago, thanks to my sister, one of my sisters, my sister Lucille, who was living in Paris, and she got tickets for us to see the Béjart performance of Bolero. And we were in the second row.
Wow.
And I will never, ever forget that night. Ever, ever. We got the sweat on us, you know.
Wow.
It was fabulous. It is so hypnotic and so, it puts you into a trance as a piece of music, you know? I mean, it really is just seeing these bodies swaying back and forth and everything. It's fabulous. But I think I can see why some people really, really would not like it. But the irony, of course, is that it became an absolute international success. And they say, you know, who knows if it's true, that an example of Bolero is played every 10 minutes somewhere in the world. And considering that it lasts 17 minutes, so this is good. This is good for chat to figure out if this is true or not. That basically means that there's never a moment when Bolero is not being played somewhere in the world. You know?
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true. And also, they've made so many different versions of it, like with all sorts, like some of them sound awful. It's like some Casio from the 60s sound. It's awful.
Right.
And then some of them sound really, really good. So it just depends on who's performing it.
It definitely does. He also did, very interestingly, he wrote 2 piano concertos for a left hand. And it's because he had a friend who lost his right hand in the war, in World War I. He was a pianist. He asked him to write music for him that he could play just with his left hand.
It's the Concerto for Left Hand is what it's called.
I don't know if I've ever heard it.
Yeah, I've heard some of it. It's part of the things I was listening to this morning. Well, I wouldn't say it's my favorite of his, but it's very interesting. And it's wonderful that he took the challenge to write a piece mostly for a one-handed pianist. I mean, that is just not something you do, you know. And as someone who was as famous as he was, he could have just turned it down, you know, but he did it.
He did it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess he was one of those people. It sounds like he loved the challenge no matter what. I mean, this was basically, he considered that all music was interesting, and he was trying most of his life to figure out how to incorporate different rhythms, different patterns of music into his own compositions. And so basically that is what he did. He performed and composed for over 40 years. He eventually bought a house in the suburbs, about 30 kilometers outside of Paris, in a town called Montfort d'Amaury.
Mm-hmm.
But he still went into Paris all the time to go to the nightclubs, to see live music, to hang out with his friends, to see the dancers. His life was the nightlife of Paris. And in 1933, he got hit by a car.
Oh.
And what happened was, and this is one of those ironies, but it's not just with him, that they discovered when they took him to the hospital that he was having, he actually had an incurable neurological problem. They didn't put any name on it. I've never found anything that said what it was. But apparently it kind of got set off by, or got worse because of getting hit in the head in this car accident. And he had to stop. He stopped composing and he stopped playing because it had probably affected his hands as well as his mental capacities. And he died in 1937, just a day or two after having had surgery to see if they could actually repair something to make him feel better. So he was not an old man. He was only 62 when he died.
Wow. It's impressive to me that because, there are a lot of composers who wrote a lot of things because they felt compelled to, they had ideas every 5 seconds. But composing music is very difficult. My father-in-law is a composer and has been commissioned to write many pieces and so forth. And it's not an easy process. It is really a lot of work is involved because they need to make sure that all the instruments can perform this. They show off what the instrument can do is what they're trying to do. Whatever the theme of the music or the tune of the music is. It's a lot of work. And finding inspiration for new music is not easy. It's like everything has been written already, it seems.
Well, yeah, again, equating it to the equivalent in painting, for instance, it's exactly, you could say the same thing. You have to figure out how to make something new that hasn't been done before. That's what's so amazing about it. When Ravel died, there was already, the much more into the atonal music and other kinds of music that come up. Of course, there's been a lot of music that was created through the 20th century, but really he is considered to be one of the two greatest innovators of modern music, introducing things that become part of what is known as modern music. And that was what he basically dedicated his life to.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because his music, it's like it's in constant motion. It flows kind of like water, it just never stops. And I think it's really good to listen to when you're trying to work and concentrate on what you're doing because it's always a satisfying pattern and your brain likes to have a satisfying pattern to hang on to while your hands are typing or doing something else. I really like to listen to some of his pieces while working. Not while sleeping, because another thing he did is he took very well-known tunes, but well-known to like the south of Spain or well-known to some African group or something. And he would speed them up and make that the theme of his music. So he had a lot of purposeful research into finding new melodies, It was still melodic kind of work, whereas the people that followed him threw the melody out of the door and you like kicked it to the curb and were like, it doesn't have to be melodic at all. Which, maybe not.
Well,
maybe it does.
Maybe it does. Maybe it does, yeah.
It's really interesting to me that his music has lived on despite the fact that, I think somebody asked him about the Bolero and he said, yeah, it's the best piece I've ever written except there's no music in it. And what he meant is
there to put you into a trance, I think.
Yeah, but there's plenty of music in it. And I think it's the introduction to a lot of people to classical music, to, not pop, not easy listen stuff, just like you. I remember vividly watching Bolero and Béjart, not in person, on TV. But man, that was a performance. That was like, it's not something you forget. So it's well deserved that he sticks out in people's minds. I get it. I think he's a genius. And he wrote some pieces that were a bit edgy as well. He was at the cusp of big change, but he's most famous for a Bolero that is not all that challenging.
It's just fascinating, that he started out really coming out of the tradition of a much more traditional romantic kind of classical music and then worked his way into the absolute announcement of modern and contemporary and experimentation. I find him more interesting to listen to, for instance, than Debussy, who bores me after 10, 15 minutes.
All right.
Yeah. I Debussy is fine for putting me to sleep, But I was listening to you thinking, for me, the comparison in a strange way is with Mozart and, for instance, the magic flute. There's something about certain pieces of music that stay with you forever and ever and ever.
Right. So Mozart was 150 years earlier than Ravel. But it is true that they both adhere to the same kind of principles and rules of composition. It's just that Ravel introduced tunes from other cultures, other places, which Mozart didn't. And that's where, Ravel and Gershwin are so close because they are both very, very well trained composers who can write fabulous work, but are very influenced by jazz.
Right.
that makes them really interesting to listen to, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But when you have time, like when you want to listen to music, what do you turn on, Elyse?
In the car, I listen to a station called FIP.
Yeah, so that's
France Inter Paris. One of the things that's interesting about it is that it's all music. I don't like talk radio at all. I just have this thing. I hate talk radio.
Here's a podcaster who doesn't like to talk. Ha!
I love listening to music in the car. And one of the things I found out about this station is that from the beginning, they decided that they only wanted women as, it's not DJs and announcers.
Yeah.
So for a specific reason, when it began, this, I don't know,
Soft voices, very smooth.
And so you have different people. I never know who they are. I never pay attention. But like every couple of hours, they change. So I know that there are different times of the day when it's either American stuff like blues and old rock, or it can be classical, or it can be this, or it can be that. And so I love the fact that I don't know what I'm going to be listening to when I put on the radio, but it's always music.
Huh.
The reason why I don't like listening to talk in the car is because I get distracted. See, so the music is kind of like, if I don't have the music on in the car, I think there's something wrong. What's going on in the car? You know, oh, did I leave the door open? You know, something's weird, you know. But that's what I listen to. And at home, I listen a lot when I'm not using a disc. I have a lot of music, but I don't always put the music on. I listen to France musique at certain times of the day. And that is, I like too, because I do interviews with singers and composers and musicians. And I like listening to them talk about their art, their music.
Yeah,
you know?
so you do like talk sometimes.
Yeah. It's just not in the car. It's like, ooh, I don't know if I'm going left or right if I'm in the car. You know?
That's funny. Because I can listen to anything in the car.
I know. But no, at home I can. At home I do. And I will sit and listen to an interview with a composer or a musician. And I find it fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
And very often what I do is like if I'm watching a movie or something and they play something that's interesting, or France Culture, France, what's the name of that station? It's
France Musique, France Classique, et France Culture.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure we got the names perfectly right, but they often play things like I listen to Franck Ferrand. I really like Franck Ferrand as a historian. Right. And in between his historical stuff, he will play part of a symphony or a concerto or something. And very often I just pause the thing and I start listening to the whole thing. Yeah. And then perhaps I go back to whatever he was talking to, whatever person he was talking about, but perhaps I don't. So that's often how I work. I often use Shazam to see what they're playing, like in the movies. And sometimes it is classical, not always, you know. And then I listen to the whole thing. I like to listen to the whole album. Like recently, I was listening to someone who talked about Tracy Chapman, and I listened to the whole Revolution album. It is fascinating to listen to that whole thing. Of course, doesn't much to do with Ravel, but equally inventive, I think, very, very out there as a person. So I just like to hear the whole thing. When I start with a musician, I just like to listen to a lot of it.
I think I'm going to go home and listen to some Ravel.
Yes. But when I walk the dog, I don't know. Classical music for walking, it's not my thing.
No. You need something a little bit more.
I'm pretty sure there's lots of people who listen to classical music while walking too.
We'll find out.
Yes, perhaps they will tell us.
Tell us, what do you listen to and when?
Well, yeah, when do you listen to when you're driving, walking, and not listening to this podcast, clearly. Merci beaucoup, Elyse.
De rien, Annie.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for giving back and supporting the show. Patreon supporters get new episodes as soon as they are ready and ads free. If that sounds good to you, be like them. Follow the link in the show notes. Patrons also get more exclusive rewards for doing that. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Patreon, join us, no spaces or dashes. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Karen Lewis, Nat, Christopher Pace, and Beatrice. Thank you all, and to all my current patrons. It is wonderful to have you on board with the community of Francophiles who keep this podcast going. And to support Elyse, go to patreon.com/ElyseArt, ELYSART. This week I published a reward for patrons. It was a casual convo between Elyse and I where we talked about all sorts of things. And these are unscripted, just casual conversations. And I also had a Zoom meeting with my patrons. It's always great talking to all of you face to face. I want to read 2 reviews of my voice map tours this week. One person said, I did it in the afternoon on my own and again at night with my husband when we got out of his conference. Great. Wow. Yes, doing it twice. Lots of people report that they enjoy doing them twice because they are kind of very dense, some of them especially, and very fun. So another person wrote, absolutely perfect method to enjoy Paris at your own pace. The combination of knowledge and technology delivers a great experience. This was our 4th visit to Paris, but the first experience with Annie's wonderful guidance. Great pace. Love the brief but so informative vignettes along the way. We shared earbuds and almost stayed together. Stopped many times along the way to shop and eat. Looking forward to the next 4 tours we purchased. Thank you very much for those reviews. Yes, I think people really enjoy those. And podcast listeners get a big discount for buying these tours from my website. You can see this at joinusinfrance.com/boutique. There's also a new review of my new tour called Savoring Paris, a food lover's walk around Les Halles. This person said, Annie Sargent's walking tours are excellent with clear descriptions, great history and anecdotes, and practical tips. I've been to Paris several times and always learn something new on her tours. They enhance any trip to Paris. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, let me share a few thoughts about taking the train in France. Of course, traveling by train in France offers a splendid window into the heart of French culture and landscape. It blends efficiency with the pleasure of unhurried movement through the countryside and cities as well. But for those unaccustomed to train travel, which is a lot of my listeners, as a matter of fact, especially if you're from a country where the railway system does not form the backbone of public transportation, here are some reflections and practical tips to enhance your journey. And if you want more details, you should definitely listen to episode 428, All Aboard the French Train System. All right, here's a few tips. French trains are typically punctual, but of course there are, exceptions. But you need to be on time. Trains wait for no one. The doors close minutes before departure. So check train schedules in advance and aim to arrive at the station at least 30 minutes before your train departs. This buffer lets you navigate the station, validate your ticket if necessary, and find the correct platform without too much stress. Your train platform is not going to be announced until 20 minutes before it's time to leave. Just be aware of that, and you should really check the train number. On your ticket, it says it gives you a train number. Check that against what you see on the displays. You have to understand the French ticket systems. Tickets can be purchased online through apps, at station kiosks. They can be paper. They can be on your app. I really recommend that you just buy your tickets from either the website or the app, and that you have your train code, your QR code on your phone. Okay, this is the easiest way. That way you don't have to worry about, do I need to validate this ticket or whatever. It's a code and you're good to go. You have to learn a little bit about navigating the stations. Train stations are hubs of activity, but they are well organized. The information screens display departure and arrival times, just like an airport. The platform, which we say voie, V-O-I-E, the numbers are crucial for boarding the train at the right place, like I mentioned. If you're not sure, ask station staff. They usually have red jackets, or fellow passengers for help. Knowing basic French, helps as well. But depending on where you are, it's not mandatory. You have to select the right seat. If your ticket includes a reserved seat, you have to find that one so you have to find the right car, the right carriage, I guess, and also the right seat number. The trains are long. Carriages are usually labeled both inside and outside. There's a big number 1 or number 2 on the side of the train. That's the class of the train. To find the car number, that's on a small little screen on the side. And that will say, car number blah, blah, blah. And it will show you where the seats are. if they're upstairs or downstairs for the TGV. Luggage. Unlike air travel, they don't take your luggage away and give it back at the end of the trip. But there are racks, just like you'll find on a shuttle bus, like the shuttle bus that takes you to the airport. There are racks where everybody puts their luggage, right? Well, it's the same on the train. You will put your luggage there. Typically, I recommend that you keep your valuables with you in your purse or on a smaller backpack or carry-on that you can have with you at all times. So you'll put your big piece of luggage on the racks. You can lock them up if you want to. I don't find that necessary. I'm not aware of theft on the train being a big deal. Perhaps it was years ago, but it's not today. So just relax, okay? But do keep your valuables with you on your person, obviously. And once you find your seat, you will have a little space to put some luggage in front of you and also above your head for mostly coats and things like that. And then you just need to enjoy the ride, okay? It's very scenic. Just relax, have a good time. You can read. Depending on the seat you booked, you may have a plug or not. Some places don't. Sometimes there's food on the train. Sometimes there's not. Even if there is food on the train, I don't like the food on the train, so I bring my own. Just relax. You'll get there soon enough. And they'll make announcements in French. But there are also kind of signs inside, like screens inside of the train. And if you have your ticket on the app, you can follow your own train on the app as well. So extra points for the apps. If you purchase your tickets on the app, that's where you'll go find information about possible delays, possible strikes, which again, strikes do happen. Strikes get announced all the time. Most of the time, the strike doesn't go forward. So don't panic. Wait until the day before, 24 hours before a strike. They need to say if they're really doing it or not. And I know it's hard to wait that long, but you just have to. And if there is a strike, if your train is canceled, they never cancel all the trains. So it might delay you a little bit, but it's not going to ruin your trip. Unless you booked your days like you're a lunatic. And if you listen to me, you probably don't do that. So. And also, just so you know, the train is the most ecological way to travel. It's even better than an electric car, if you can believe that. So enjoy the trains in France. Be aware that they don't go everywhere, that it's not the fast train that goes everywhere. Oh, and yes, this week she had read on the fine print that she could, for a 19-euro fee, she could change her departure city. Well, yes, you can, but that's only if you want to depart from a city that's on that same line, okay? You cannot change departure city to a completely different line. If you need to do that, get a refund on that first ticket and get a different one, okay? Which you can do with some, it's just like airlines. Sometimes you can get a refund on your ticket, sometimes you cannot. Read the fine print. My thanks to podcast editors Anne and Christian Codovan, who produced the transcripts. Next week on the podcast, a trip report with Joseph O'Reilly about the two faces of Provence. It was a fun recording. I think you'll enjoy it, especially if you're going to Provence, or if you have a thing for Provence, and who doesn't. You have to listen to that one. And remember, patrons get an ad-free version of this episode. Click on the link in the show notes to be like them. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2024 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.